My father's a Jewish educator, and I know how little respect most educators get. I know how little money most educators get. As a professor, we get a little more respect, not so much in the money department. And the degree of sacrifice that's required, the degree of soul that's required, the degree of being on top of one thing after another, and unfortunately, the growing intolerance among so many parents and so many students. We walk into our classrooms, we walk into our jobs all too often not welcomed. And so I just want to honor all the work each and every one of you does, and really thank you for being part of the solution, not part of the problem in so many ways. That is a Zionist move, because part of the power of Zionism is looking at the problems of the world and not just giving up, but saying, how do we fix them? How do we make them better? Unfortunately, when we talk about Israel education, people often come with a lot of political burdens. And one of the things I'm going to try to emphasize today is the need not to run away from politics, not to run away from hard questions, not to run away from the Palestinian issue or the other elephants in the room, but first start with identity. First start with who we are. First start with the extraordinary jujitsu, J-E-W, of a people lost, broken, listless in many ways, coming back to life through the power of ideas and through the power of lowercase l, liberal democratic ideas. But unfortunately, as I said, there's a lot of baggage. And so one of the things I like to do with students, I start with what I call the perception game. Which Israel do you see? When you say Israel, do you think of the Jewish democratic or the religious conflicts? Do you think of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Or you say, no, I can't talk conflict, so it's all in Israel of Hava Nagila and blue and white flowers and beautiful things. I'm suffocating from that binary conversation. I'm suffocating from that either-or conversation. I think we really need to figure out in our classrooms, in our schools, in our seminars, in our Zionist salons, how we create a platform where we can agree to disagree, but we can also turn the cliche around, agree to agree, find some common ground too. Find some things in which we say, yeah, I may come to certain different conclusions politically or ideologically or territorially, but I also want to talk to you, engage with you. And part of that is understanding the grays, understanding complexity, not doing either or, not doing the perfect Israel or the evil Israel, but understanding as we understand instinctively with the United States of America, with Canada, with our home countries, with the places where we live, it gets complicated, but you can sift through. When I speak to students, I always say, if you come away from one of my lectures and say, hallelujah, I see the light, you make me nervous because somebody else is going to come. They're going to be funnier. They're definitely going to be better looking. And you'll see their light. If you say, hallelujah, I see the grays, then we're talking. Then we're starting the conversation. Now, in that spirit, I changed the lecture from the time that Rich and I first started talking about this. And I should thank Rich and the entire team for welcoming me tonight. Watching the news, watching what's been going on, especially in the last 3 painful weeks, I felt that it was important to kind of steer right into that conversation and look at some of the challenges, particularly on the Israel education front. I'm an American historian. I could lecture for a very long time about racism in America and Black Lives Matter. I don't want to do that. I want to stick to our very small lens and ask some of the core questions that we need to ask and look at some of the challenges. And to do that, I'm going to make a special request. I'm going to ask that we all listen generously. Look, I have no notes. I'm speaking spontaneously, but I'm speaking from the heart. I ask each of us, each of you, to listen to me as you want your students and their parents to listen to you. And I say that because, frankly, these are tough times on the education circuit. I was speaking at another conference of Israel educators about 1.5 years ago, and I talked, as I suggested in my introduction, about the importance of going from politics to identity. I talked, as I'll get to later, that when I look at this generation, I look at this generation as the torchbearers. I talked about, again, I'll be getting this later, about the importance of nationalism, not white nationalism, not xenophobic nationalism, but liberal democratic nationalism as the kind of nationalism that created the miracle of the United States of America with all its flaws, and the miracle of Zionism / the state of Israel with all their flaws. And a young 35 or so year old Israel educator came up to me and he said, I want you to know that every time you said torchbearers and every time you said nationalism, all I heard was Trump, Charlottesville, and Nuremberg. And I went, wow, you weren't listening to me. You were listening with your own issues, with your own agenda. So I'll leave more than enough time for questions. And also, you saw at the beginning, my email is giltroy@gmail.com. Unfortunately, because it's Zoom and it's too many of us, we can't really have a full conversation. I'll make a presentation, but let's learn together and listen together. And let's acknowledge that it often is, not always, and I don't like to look at every university as on fire. And one of the things I always emphasize with students on gap years here in Israel is don't think that just by coming into your university, every university is a hostile environment. But there are some universities which are a hostile environment. This is a poster from a lecture I was supposed to give at Harvard in early March called Why I'm a Zionist, about identity Zionism. And this is in Thaler Hall, where first it was smothered with anti-Israel posters, and then it was ripped, and then it was ultimately torn down. And that is part of the environment. But we can't be too reactive. We can't be too defensive. We have to look at the negative, push back against the negative, but also build on the positive. And let's acknowledge that to the extent that the world has become binary, to the extent that too much of the conversation today is really either or, there's one package. The good people, to 75% of the American Jewish community, are anti-Trump and anti-racism and pro-Black Lives Matter. And I'm going to touch on partisan issues, but I'm not trying to endorse one side or another, but that's the package. Or Donald Trump and his people say, no, we've got our own thing going on, and we're the ones who are pro-Israel. To the extent that it's either or, when certain forces in the United States of America, in the progressive world, are connecting the dots between Zionism and racism, between Ferguson and Gaza, or Minneapolis and Gaza. When on Juneteenth, we see that a memorial/protest is open to all minus cops and Zionists, we have to be aware of two things. One, don't overgeneralize. Don't say that it's just all about, that defines Black Lives Matter. Don't say it defines the entire progressive conversation, but there's an element there. And the either-orness is a problem for us. And of course, the big lie that Israel and the IDF is responsible for militarizing the police and for teaching police the techniques. There's an important article in the foreword by Stephen Pomerantz, who was one of the people who initiated the back and forth between some of the Jewish organizations and the IDF. And he talked about visiting hospitals. He talked about, yes, sharing certain techniques, but they tended to be more counterterrorism than counter-protest. And so there's this big lie out there, and it's hurting us. And too many of our young people, out of really very important and idealistic impulses, are buying one thing or another. Similarly, my friends on the right tell me that Black Lives Matter is anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist. My friends on the left don't even want to deal with it. The truth is a little bit gray, that the August 2016 Black Lives Matter platform, which is the Black Lives Matter organization, in that incarnation had a 40,000 word platform, 39,000 words or so about American domestic policy, and a focus on Israel and Palestine and accusations of genocide. But that has been taken down, and the Black Lives Matter moment is much bigger than that. And so we as educators have to be playing in the gray, have to be juggling the complexity. And we're fighting against oversimplification. We're fighting against one word, one image, and we have to rely on paragraphs without being defensive. But the ultimate move, the first move, is really inviting people into a conversation of complexity, not being defensive, not being reactive. But we're told again and again that Zionism is racism. They're trying to connect Zionism with white supremacy and Zionism and superiority. And then, bad enough, we're getting it from the left. We're also getting it from the right. I'm actually very happy as a Jew. I worry so much about division between the left and the right. Sometimes hating Jews is something where the extreme left and the extreme right can agree. So maybe there's a bridge. That was sarcastic. Don't misquote me, right? But this is actually one of the problems. And then what happens? Anti-Semitism gets politicized. And so my friends on the left are always yelling about the dog whistles and about the gesturing and about the most subtle forms of anti-Semitism they can see on the right, for which I have zero tolerance. My friends on the right are always yelling about what's going on the campus and about the dog whistling and the gesturing, for which they have zero tolerance on the left. And I say, no, 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 I need my left-wing friends cleansing, having zero tolerance for left-wing anti-Semitism. And I need my right-wing friends having zero tolerance for right-wing anti-Semitism. But we also have to be the people of the middle path. And we have to talk about the fact that Black Lives Matters to this rabbi and so many others. That it hasn't just been a story of either or. And look at this, if not now, when? I know where that comes from. It comes from the Jewish heritage, and it's something we share. I don't call that cultural appropriation. I call that interaction. I call that healthy diversity. I call that true pluralism. So a true intersectionality is where we say, yeah, there's pain from racism. There's pain from anti-Semitism. I would never be arrogant enough to to equate the experience of an African-American in the United States of America with the experience of a Jew in the United States of America. But I do think that the true insight behind intersectionality was, yeah, oppressions have a certain shared trauma. So we have to see that, yes, there's something that links the suffering of women and the suffering of blacks and the suffering of gays and the suffering of trans and the suffering of Jews, although Jews are blocked at the intersection. And that's true intersectionality. And so we have an overlapping and then reinforcing, but not equivalent fight against bigotry. And our real challenge, the real jujitsu, J-E-W, is a true pluralism isn't just looking at the other, but it's also looking at the mirror with pride. And I call this Pilates Judaism, Pilates Zionism, Pilates Israel education. We have to strengthen our core. And when we truly have self-respect, when we truly have no tolerance for hatred, that leads to the kind of mutual respect and the zero tolerance for hatred that we need, that can really create the kind of allyship and the bonding that we need. And if I was having this conversation with you 2 months ago, I might have focused on all the imagery that we've seen, the good old-fashioned traditional anti-Semitic imagery we've seen with COVID. But we have to understand that our students are coming with that static. Our students are coming sometimes with those issues, and we ourselves are confused, and we ourselves are fighting, and we ourselves are disagreeing. And I want to sometimes lean into those disagreements, but sometimes pull out of those disagreements and be aware that indeed, we're all traumatized by living in an age of demonization. I don't care if you're left wing or right wing. I don't care if you're religious or not religious. I don't care if you're Jewish or not Jewish. But the singling out of Israel for what I call delegitimization derby. I don't just like this policy. I don't just dislike this prime minister, but therefore Israel doesn't have the right to exist, has distorted the conversation, has traumatized all of us, has made my friends on the right far too defensive, have made my friends on the left too easy and too eager to jump on that delegitimization derby. My friends on the center way too silent and beaten up. And I need a proud, strong, muscular moderation, an apolitical shvil zahav, a golden path. And so, yeah, in the 19th century, Zionism revived pride in the label Jew. Today, Jews have to revive pride in the label Zionist. In the 1950s and 1960s, Israel was fragile. The Zionist conversation was robust. Today, Israel's robust, and the Zionist conversation has turned fragile. And so that was the challenge that I took on when I was asked to update the Zionist Idea. And you can see, here's a friend of mine, David Breakstone, who had a beaten up copy, because for those of us in the 50s, I wasn't born yet, 60s, 70s, 80s, it was our Bible. We read it backwards and forwards. A.D. Gordon, Achad Ha'am, Theodore Herzl. Unfortunately, no room for women in that 700-page book. Unfortunately, no room for Mizrahi voices. And so I was asked to update it, and I did 3 moves. And those 3 moves I want to share with you as keys to some of the challenges that I faced and that I want you to face in the opening part of this conversation.
Before we move on to the Zionist ideas, there was a question posed by one of the participants that relates to sort of your opening piece that I think it would be good to address now before we transition. It's a lengthy question. I'll read it. It's also in the chat. When we see lies like Zionism is racism, what are we supposed to do? I ask because as Jews, when we try to explain our identity or even what the word Zionism means at its base, we are the only minority who is not allowed to define our own identity. Jews have a history of being pro-minority rights, So what are we supposed to do when we want to be a part of these movements, but anti-Semitism prevents us from being there? As you said, we have to fight angry slogans with paragraphs when those attacking us aren't willing to listen to define our own identity.
Let me take it in three different directions. The first, the most important answer I think I can give is that when the question is asked, if we ourselves don't have the right answer, if our students don't have the right answer, that's our biggest failure. I'm less concerned with scoring the propaganda point and more concerned with making sure that we have taught our students and ourselves and their parents, frankly. We always focus on the students. I always say, well, what about the parents? The truth. And go back to the extraordinary speech that Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a liberal Democrat, an Irish Catholic, good New Yorker, who in 1975 is the US ambassador to the United Nations. And he comes into the United Nations and he says, I didn't really have any ties to Israel. In fact, I kind of resented it because some of my academic friends had gotten these cool trips to Israel. I hadn't gotten one. But he sees the attack in 1975 by a coalition of the Soviets and the Palestinians and the Arab propagandists, calling Zionism racism as an attack on democracy and decency, as an attack on the United States of America's best friend, as an attempt to try to get at the United States of America through Israel. And this liberal Democrat, who goes on to represent New York in the United States Senate for 4 terms and fights Ronald Reagan and fights for welfare reform and fights for the Franklin Roosevelt vision in the 1980s and the 1990s, such as it can survive, it gives a beautiful speech, a great text to learn from, November 10th, 1975. And one of the things he says, and one of the things we're missing educationally, is he makes 2 moves. He says, 1, what are Jews? Judaism isn't just a religion. Jews are both members of a religion, but also members of a nation, what I call the Oreo cookie, that we have the cookie part and the cream part. We have the nation part and the religion part. And because of that, and because you can convert into the Jewish religion and then become a part of the Jewish nation, the Jews are among the least race-based, the least biologically based, the most permeable, the most welcoming form of liberal nationalism there is. So it's not just that Zionism is not racism, because that echoes the issue, but that Zionism is a form of liberal democratic nationalism. So the first move is making sure we understand that and we can teach that to our kids and to the broader community. The second is when asked that question, yeah, you can quote Daniel Patrick Moynihan, you can talk about the fact that it's actually a hijacking, and we can also talk about this with apartheid, right? And this comes from a position of tremendous respect for Palestinians. I respect Palestinian nationalism. I will never negate the Palestinian national identity. But that means that it's a national clash between Palestinians and Jews, Palestinians and Israelis. And there are dark-skinned Israelis and light-skinned Palestinians. And if I'm respecting Palestinian nationalism enough to call it a national clash, a nationalist clash, then how can it also be race? And when I see terms like racism, colonialism, imperialism hijacked and injected into the conversation against us, that's not an intellectual critique. That's, I'm sorry to say, a demonization, a delegitimization, an anti-Semitic critique, a negationist critique. The third part is the harder part, which is how do we ally? We ally by simply saying, and it's kind of basic self-respect 101. I will march with you. I will fight with you. I will fight bigotry in all its forms with you. But that also means fighting bigotry against me and my people. And that's true allyship. It was long-winded, but I think that's an important question. So the move from the Zionist Idea to the Zionist Ideas was a threefold move. 1, add the S. Open up the conversation. Left, right, religious, non-religious. From 34 texts to 168 texts. So you have to cut while you add. Welcome Henrietta Zold, the poetess Rachel, Golda Meir, Stav Shafir to the conversation, not as affirmative action, but as basic historic justice, as basic accuracy. And I love the S because the S is like a question mark. And you can hear one of my themes. Too many of our conversations about Israel is exclamation points. We need more question marks, more openness. So that was the first move. And understanding the power of Zionism, because Israel is a country. Zionism is basically saying, we are a people, that Oreo cookie. We have the rights to a particular homeland and the rights to establish a state on that homeland, like 192 other countries in the United Nations today. So the first move is Zionist Idea to Zionist Ideas. Of course, the biggest move was being truly subversive and keeping the word Zionism, because I want to bring pride back to that word, even though people tell me it doesn't poll well. The second move is historically. If you have 168 thinkers, you have to divide them up. Pioneers, builders, and now you're going to know the third one because I already gave it away at the beginning. Torchbearers. Who are we? We're heirs, but the torchbearer in the Olympic relay passes it on, keeps it going, may go to an alternate energy source. And now let's pause for a second before I get to the third move. And let's go to the important work of Jonathan Haidt, who talks about being a good University of Pennsylvania graduate student, who then goes on to University of Chicago, studies with a guy named Richard Schwader. And Richard Schwader is this great cultural anthropologist. You've got to love the question of why do men barbecue, right? He wants to understand sort of like basic cultural anthropology. And Schwader talks about autonomy, community, divinity as basic pillars. And Haidt says, I didn't get it. I was a good liberal atheist. I'd grown up, he doesn't go really into his Jewish identity, but he'd grown up in like a good suburban Jewish household. And he says, I'm in India, and I really like these people. And I want to like these people, but I've got to say their rituals are kind of primitive. It strikes me as sexist that every time a serious conversation starts, the men start talking and the women leave the room. They have all kinds of other crazy rituals. But I go back to Richard Schwader's article and I start thinking about it. And I realize that, yes, what's the most powerful gift that the United States of America gave me? Autonomy. I, me, my. But most human beings in the world also want community, also want to connect to one another. And they also want divinity, sanctity, something bigger than themselves. And he starts realizing that all these crazy rituals are props in identity building. And rather than judging his new friends, he starts feeling a little culturally deprived. He starts feeling, I'm really good on autonomy. I'm not so good on community, and I'm not so good on divinity or sanctity. And if we really plunge into identity building, of course, he makes a more elaborate model of 6, but I have too much of a pea brain. I can remember 3. And I think there's actually a nice way of starting to build identity Zionism. Ani, the I, anachnu, the us, the community, and some sense, it could be secular or religious, of divinity, of sanctity, of a greater mission. And of course, we have to ask the question, where do we begin? And when we talk about Zionism, we talk about, it really starts with the Bible. It's not a real estate brochure. It doesn't give us title, but it starts the conversation as the original Aboriginal people, the Jewish homeland. In the mid-1800s, as nationalism forms, that word again that we're going to get to soon, Jewish peoplehood, and Theodor Herzl's move, Jewish statehood. And again, those are the 3 dimensions. What is Zionism? I like to use the word Zionism a lot in a lecture and then stop in the middle and ask students, what does this word Zionism mean? And then define it. Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. And Medinat Yisrael. Does it mean that because we have rights to that land, that no one else has rights to those lands? No, and I'm talking about Manhattan. You can tell from my accent, I'm a New Yorker, and we know that Manhattan was purchased from Native Americans for $24. Having conflict over land doesn't negate our rights, but doesn't negate others' rights either. And of course, as I said at the beginning, one of the exciting, one of the inspiring stories we don't tell enough is how a broken nation, a nation in exile, the Galut Jew, becomes the powerful Jew. The third move I made, from Zionist Idea to Zionist Ideas, from a mishmash to first founders, then builders, to torchbearers. And then I organized in 6 schools of Zionist thought. Political Zionism, emphasizing people, land, state, of Theodor Herzl. Socialist Zionism, the notion that we return to the land. And by the way, you as educators will appreciate this, that I built my vision based on a camp activity I did in Camp Tel Yehuda with a very charismatic educator named Mel Riesfield, who didn't have his R's, but had his philosophy and theology and ideology intact. And he would tell us, I'm going to teach Zionism. I need a black beard. I need a hoe. I need a white beard. I need a wheel. And we said, okay, Mel's off his raka. But it's actually quite brilliant. Political Zionism, the black beard, Theodor Herzl. The hoe or the rake, socialist Zionism. The white beard, religious Zionism. A fist for revisionist Zionism. Although, of course, revisionist Zionism is also about liberal ideology, and in a longer lecture, in a different lecture, we could get more into that. Then the wheel is cultural Zionism, that the Jewish people are a wheel. Ki mitzion tetzei. Everybody sing with me? Torah, even though you're on mute. From the center shall come forth new visions, new ideas, new understandings, a cultural resurgence. And those are the 5 schools of Zionist thought that sang, Anu banu artsa livnotu lihibanot ba, we've come to build and be rebuilt. But of course, I insisted that we add a 6th school of Zionist thought, Brandesian Zionism, Henrietta Zold Zionism, diaspora Zionism. And today, my move is to go from diaspora Zionism to what I call identity Zionism. And indulge me, I'm wrapping up in the next few minutes, indulge me one of those awful light bulb jokes. How many gurus does it take to change a light bulb? Trust your inner light. How many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? You can only change if you want to change. How many men does it take to change a light bulb? One, he holds it and thinks the whole world revolves around himself. How many feminists does it take to change a light bulb? That's not funny. I bashed men so I could bash women. How many Zionists does it take to change a light bulb? 5. 1 to change the light bulb. 2 to go singing and dancing. Anu banu artsa livnotu lihibanot ba, we've turned to the land. Look at us. We're heroes. We're pioneers. The 4th, to write the checks. And the 5th, to complain about the media coverage. Once upon a time, diaspora Zionism, your job, your student's job, was to write the checks, shut up and complain about the media coverage. But my Zionism is about identity Zionism. My Zionism is saying, no, we're part of this broader conversation before we get to politics, before we get to complexity of who am I? And by the way, I think that when you take an identity Zionist approach to the Palestinian problem, because I'm not afraid of politics, you say that criticizing can be constructive, learning, building, but demonizing, delegitimizing is destructive. We start with mutual respect, that Pilates, Zionism, Judaism, and I want to maximize everyone's freedoms, everyone's sense of identity. That's why I'll never negate Palestinian nationalism. I understand that they have identity issues too, and as I said at the beginning, we see the grays, not the light. And I finish up with just a few thoughts. One, Hillel Halkin's wonderful, wonderful reminder, what I said at the beginning, what a great adventure. Nothing like it in human history. A small and ancient people forget their land, forget their language, although we always had a small group staying there, and we always prayed in that direction. And we were restored, and we're renewed. That's one of the greatest stories in history. And if John Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, I'm asking first, what can your country do for you? What can having an Israel, what can having a Zionist identity do for us? How does that give us inspiration? How does that give us a common conversation? How does it give us bridges in a Jewish world also, which is increasingly all left or all right, all pro-Trump, all anti-Trump, all Black Lives Matter or disdainful? Maybe, rather than making Israel the bone of contention, the central headache of the Jewish people, it can be our peoplehood platform. It can be our way in to asking questions about who am I and what does it mean to be living in Atlanta or Miami or New York City and be a part of that. And from there, go from autonomy to community to sanctity. And if we have time for one more quick round of thoughts, I have my little 10 commandments of how to teach Israel education. One, not just, there was one Zionist movement, one Zionist defining idea of land, people, state, but many different Zionisms. 2, idol worship is totalitarianism, either orness. And we need to have a breakdown of that and a dialogue. And Natan Sharansky and I have just written a book about the importance of dialogue. And we call it Never Alone, because the Jewish people have to go from a defensive mode of never again to a wonderful mode, community, sanctity. You're never alone if you're part of this conversation. I want us to be proud, but not vain. I want us to point out that during COVID, there was this famous picture of a Muslim and a Jew working together through American Friends of Magen David Adom, through the Zionist platform of helping one another out all over the world. But I don't want to boast so much that I can't also be critical of some of the issues that have to do with Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews. But most important of all, I always say, is don't just protest, don't just focus on Israel. Advocacy, remember identity. I call that the Sabbath day and keeping it holy. Treating Israel, as Jonathan Sachs called it, as our classroom, not just as our problem. Every conversation shouldn't be an I-it about what you should do, but about who we are with respect. And don't kill conversation, as I said at the beginning, but question. Have democratic learning and growth. I want us to commit adultery. I want us to ally with others and understand the power of liberal nationalism. Understand that nationalism is often seen as a dirty word these days, but the nationalism that I know of as an American historian and as a Jewish historian and as a Zionist and as a Jew is a constructive one. And we do have to fight against anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, but not let it define us. Never, never, never lie. Never, never, never try to score the cheap propaganda point to make your point. And you know what? Don't covet. Our enemies might get the PR line, but I trust our story. I trust our faith in ourselves, in one another, in our product. I trust our conversation in identity, not just in politics.
The first question comes from Michigan. If annexation goes through with the restrictions on the annexed populations, how will we explain that Zionism is not apartheid when it looks a lot like it is?
Anybody who tells me what's going to happen tomorrow or a week from now or 2 weeks from now with Bibi Netanyahu at the helm has a crystal ball that I don't have. But let's assume that it goes through, because I think we need to challenge ourselves on the hard questions. I take 3 controversial moves. I offend my friends from the left by saying, you know what? Why is it that all of a sudden everybody becomes an international lawyer when we talk about Israeli rights and limiting Israeli rights, but no one ever applies the same kind of hard international legal analysis to Palestinian rights? I start with the assumption that it's a mess. I start with an assumption that it's 2 peoples in love with the same land. And I start with the assumption that even though I offend my friends from the right by saying I personally may not think it may be the wise thing to do, I think we do have certain ties and certain rights to that land. So a lot of the language tends to be either or and organic. And my understanding of the Bible, but I said it's not a real estate manual on purpose because I was thinking annexation. My understanding of the British Mandate, my understanding of the San Remo Conference, my understanding of the reams of documents that Ken Stein and Rich Walters and the amazing team over there have shown us is that it's messy, complexity. So let's inject complexity. But let's say I disagree with what's going on. And I disagree with a situation in which settlers get rights and Palestinians don't. So now I have 2 opportunities. The educational opportunity is saying, nevertheless, I won't call it apartheid because apartheid is a very specific word that talks about racism, that talks about a race-based distinction between Palestinians and Israelis. And I defy anyone on this call to find a piece of legislation that's race-based. It's nationalist-based. It's neighborhood-based. It's regional-based. It's based on security. And injecting apartheid is like injecting the word race and imperialism and colonialism. They're demonizing terms and they're misleading and they're just hurtful. They don't allow me to make the democratic critique I need to make against Bibi because he'll knock me down as being on the side of the apartheid forces, those who call him apartheid and racist. So it's actually silencing me as someone who wants to be a thoughtful, critical patriot. But that's the second opportunity. And I call this the Trump-opportunity. 75% of American Jews hate Donald Trump, detest Donald Trump, abhor Donald Trump. But I've checked the numbers. As of now, they're not moving to Canada and they're not moving to Israel. What is the resistance? What is going on now in the Democratic Party? A Trump-opportunity, an opportunity for critics to say, I hate this president, I hate what he does, but I'm going to defend my America. So if you hate the annexation and it goes through, this is not an opportunity to wash your hands of Israel. It's an opportunity to roll up your sleeves and join those of us, and I'm not going to say whether I'm part of that or not, who are fighting for a liberal democratic Israel. And to also zoom out and see the broader picture. See that at the same time, this quote unquote apartheid state also, as I show you that slide, the very high percentage of Israeli Arabs who are pharmacists, who are nurses, who are doctors. To see that, again, it's a national conflict, not a racial conflict.
Next question comes from Boston. Following on your slide, an identity Zionist approach to the Palestinian challenge, in your notion of mutual respect for each person's identity, what role do you see for Israel educators in teaching about Palestinians, Palestinian nationalism, and Palestinian identity?
I see a role, but I think we have a tendency sometimes to exaggerate that role. What do I mean by that? I'm a simple guy. I'm just a kid from Queens. And I start slowly. especially when we talk about this generation, and I'm exaggerating and I'm overgeneralizing, but we know that too many of our students are really not even from the simple son and daughter, and to immediately plunge them into conflict, to immediately plunge them into teaching Palestinian identity before we've taught them the basics of Jewish identity. I don't know anybody else who does that. I don't know African Americans who spend all their time and put it as a first priority to teach white identity. I've never met many feminists who spend all that much time talking about male identity. They get to it eventually. So my problem with too many of us is that we put the Palestinian conflict and Palestinian identity issues front and center, and we don't get to it in time. My problem with others is that they never get to it. So again, I'm talking about put it in proportion, put it in the right place, in the right process. Why is it, I always say to Hillels, why is it that every program has to start with left versus right, Palestinian versus Israeli, Mizrahi versus Ashkenazi? What's going on here? We actually need to have more of a conversation. This is what I call this Yasser Arafat's greatest conceit, that everything would be about him and his people. I want it to be about me and my people. And that's Pilates. Once we're strong enough, then first of all, I'm not afraid of the conversation. And I'm not even afraid of our failures. You see, when our identity is fragile, when our identity isn't multidimensional, when our identity isn't like a really strong rope with many different strands, but it's one thin strip, then I get really nervous and I have to protect it. But if I build a real strong identity, I can say, boy, we really screwed up there. Not only that's a mistake, I'll go even further. Boy, we really did the wrong thing there, and I'm going to try to fix it. But because our identity is so fragile and the conversation is so fragile, we don't get to that complexity. So again, by teaching complexity, we teach resilience, but first start with who we are and then get to them.
Last question comes from Kansas City. You mentioned adding Mizrahi voices to the Zionist ideas. How did you go about doing this? What differences did you see between the Zionism of Ashkenazi Jews and the Zionism of Mizrahi Jews?
It was a really exciting part of my adventure because, to tell you the truth, I knew many, many women Zionists. The first time I opened up the Arthur Hertzberg book after I was given this tremendous honor and privilege and terrifying burden to update it, it was like, wait, she's missing, she's missing, she's missing, she's missing. And frankly, I wasn't up to date on the Mizrahi conversation, and that was a great opportunity to learn. So 3 interesting moves. Number 1, at the end of the day, the Zionist movement, especially in the 19th century, was invented in Eastern Europe and then Western Europe. That's just a historical fact. So you connect the dots, but you don't also want to, as a historian, distort things. Why? Because this is the point 2, which is really interesting. The conversation in Mizrahi circles is we didn't need the Zionist revolution because we were born Zionist. That much of the conversation, and if you look, many of the rabbis, there are 2 things going on. One is you don't have the same rebellion against the rabbis in Morocco, in Syria, in Egypt, in Iraq, that you have in Russia, in Germany. Partially because, frankly, I think many of the Mizrahi rabbis were much more flexible. And it was also obviously a different dynamic, oversimplifying historical phenomena. So the first thing was this notion of born Zionist was actually a lovely idea of getting into Mizrahi Zionism by saying that the Eastern Europeans and the Western Europeans had to have this torturous thing. First, I'm going to be a Westerner. And then, you read Moses Hess, they rejected me and I'm unassimilable. And, Judeophobia, we are ghosts of Pinsker and Herzl. And I'm throwing a lot of stuff out here. And in Mizrahi, it's, more simple. By the way, we should point out that Mizrahi itself is an Israeli invention, right? Jews of Iraq and Jews of Morocco and Jews of Egypt didn't call themselves Mizrahi. It's only once they came to Israel and they became otherized and bound up. So it's one of those labels that itself is problematic and needs to be unwrapped. But then part of my adventure was really opening up the texts, opening up the sources, speaking to people, and bringing in voices of rabbis from Jerba and leaders from Morocco and stunning works, which actually my editor cut out, but we're now working on the Hebrew edition and will be returned, of the great leader in France, Manitou, and having the words of Ovadia Yosef. And then there's a debate. Was Ovadia Yosef a classic Zionist? No, but they were part of the Zionist Congress. Shas was part of the World Zionist Congress. And Ovadia Yosef, I'm certainly a Zionist. And being mischievous, what's the text of Ovadia Yosef I use in the Zionist Idea? I use a text of him ultimately saying, at the end of the day, because of pikuach nefesh, because of the need to save lives, if we have an opportunity to give back territory and the defense establishment signs off on it, we should. And I'm doing that on purpose to show that there's a different kind of conversation going on. And again, the more complexity we have, the more overlapping conversations. So does that mean that he fits in religious Zionist or the more liberal labor Zionist? And if the answer is yes, or political Zionist, all the better.
We got another question. Can we shift the conversation from whether we agree or not, or if Israel is right or wrong, to whether they acted in their own national interests?
It's an interesting phrasing. I think I would put it in a number of different ways. One is I prefer us language rather than them language. So it would be almost interesting to ask the question of in our own national interest. Now that, of course, is problematic because there's also the whole question of Israelis making security questions or not. My immediate reaction to the question was to say, it's very problematic for me to be sitting in Montreal, as I did for so many years, and judging, especially on questions of life and death, especially on questions of borders. So I want to just inject a little bit of humility into the conversation. At the same time, I certainly don't want to choke the conversation or to gag us. And so it's a difficult dance. So I want to ask the question of, do we agree? Do we disagree? How do we criticize? How do we not criticize? What's in their national interest? What's in our interest as a people? At the end of the day, what's really important for me to understand is three things. One, I would say the historian's favorite text, context. Where does this come from? What is this story? What is the history? Start with some knowledge, right? Then let's look at the values that are in conflict, the values that are being thought through, that are being fought over. Let's look at the history of the search for peace. Let's look at what the status of the Jordan Valley is. I'm going from context from sort of like the basic, documents that you guys have on your amazing website to more of a kind of values conversation in which we start taking different values as instruments, as tools for understanding how I would think this through as an Israeli general, as someone sitting in Atlanta, as an educator, and then argue it out. But unfortunately, we do the opposite. We start with the gut. We start with, I read it in the New York Times and Israel's bad. And then we go backwards. And that's our work as educators. Our work as educators is really to go to the fundamentals. That's why it's so hard. That's why it's so thankless. But that's why it's so magical and so sacred. And that's why you really are the heroes to me on the front lines of making sure the conversation isn't defensive and isn't reactive, isn't closed-minded, and isn't closed-hearted, but is thoughtful, is substantive, is open-minded, and is inspirational. And we all know it's the torchbearers. Every single one of us, when we get up, we're basically mimicking our favorite teacher, the best moment we ever had with our parent, the greatest conversation we ever had with our mentor, and we're hoping somehow that we can somehow replicate that magic and pass it on to our students. And you know what? The greatest nachas, if I can sound like an old Jewish lady, is when our kids and our students do that and they're mimicking us. And the greatest joy is, this has happened to me, is, hey, you see, don't you remember you did that? And I forgot the shtick, but they remembered it. Then we've succeeded.
From Philadelphia, you noted a strong concern about the younger generation's need for more Jewish identity building. Is that also the case for students who have Jewish day school educations?
Absolutely. I'm going to now be a little controversial. I've spoken at Jewish day schools a number of times over the last couple of years in the United States, in the UK, in Australia, in Canada. And it breaks my heart when I get up and I speak to them and I say, you know the drill. I know who you are because I was one of you. And you're under such pressure to have that perfect CV and have that sky-high GPA, and especially for Americans, write that insane essay about why I am the most important person in the universe, and if this university doesn't accept me, the entire Western world is going to crumble. And we wonder why students come to college with some attitude issues. And you've all been trained to do that in this place. But there hasn't been enough of a conversation about Jewish values. And there hasn't been enough of a conversation about who you are and who you're going to be beyond your career. And you're under such pressure to have that perfect CV and that perfect GPA and get that right career and make enough money that you haven't really breathed and lived. And too many of you are going to go straight from the university registration office to search for meaning sometimes from drugs and sometimes from your therapist. But we're missing something. We have a soul problem. And by the way, when I speak to parents, I get that kind of, yeah. I've never been corrected. I've never had a student say, no, that's not what's going on in this school. In this school, we do talk about values. In this school, we do care about the soul. In this school, we do care about the Jewish heritage beyond that pressure and that power. And that's our failure. And the opportunity that we have with the framework of the Four Sons is when we get on birthright trips and when we get to Israel and when we get to your classrooms, because I'm sure you're not typical, is to have those conversations. I want my kids to succeed. I want them to have sky-high GPAs and perfect CVs and get into the right school. I'm not demeaning that. And I need those who are indeed in psychological distress to seek help. And this generation is much better at doing that than my generation certainly was. But I also need us to do that soul work. I also need us to go back to those three fundamentals that poor Jonathan Haidt was deprived of. He had an excellent education, but he didn't have the soul education. Identity, autonomy, community, sanctity. And so bless you, my children. May you find your roots. May you find sanctity and divinity, and may you find community. And through that, may we all find meaning. Thank you very much.